let's focus on the review piece, or some questions, at least in relation to the article that came to my mind when I read it. All right. So, and yeah, one thing that I came to think about as well, because I read the paper, but I also reflected on a previous interview that I had with Barry Busan. So he's English school professor Barry Busan. Because I had an interview with him, and it seems that his perception or perspective on race, rather, or racism, might be different from yours. So it would be interesting to see how your perspective would contrast to what he has to say, or what he said in the interview. And so when I interviewed him, he basically claimed, that is what he said in the interview, he claimed that racism is obsolete. And when I asked him to specify what he meant, he argued that inequality has been replaced by equality as a primary institution of international society, and hence racism is no longer legitimate. Before I ask you to, before I ask you in terms of what do you make of such a claim, given your focus on racial hierarchies in the contemporary world, before you answer that, we could just perhaps just share his we could just share perhaps one of his tables. This is yours, and we will get back to that. But this one, do you see this table here?
Let me switch my screen. Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
So basically, the English school understanding of the international relations universe, so to speak, is a international society composed of various primary institutions. And they are then connected to various derivative institutions and secondary institutions. So he's basically saying that the primary institution of equality, or equality of the people, or equality of people rather, replaced the primary institution of inequality. And the primary institution of inequality had derivative institutions such as colonialism, imperialism, and so on. And today we have the primary institution of equality of people, and derivative institutions such as human rights, humanitarian intervention, which you also study. So it's quite interesting. So what do you make of Busan's claim when he says that racism is obsolete? And what he means with that is that, the primary institution of inequality has been replaced by the primary institution of equality, and hence racism is no longer legitimate. What do you make of such a claim?
So I think that Professor Busan highlights an important point about the norm of formal equality becoming a primary institution of international society. This can make racism appear to be no longer legitimate. And I do agree that racism is widely held as inappropriate today, especially under strong norms of in laws against discrimination. Though some scholars do note that there's a pendulum here. So we may be observing, a frightening reality that the norm of racial equality is swinging in the other direction, with the rise of far-right political movements, wherein race underscores some important dynamics of democratic backlash today. That said, however, I would submit that scholars have long disrupted this notion that interactions between states today lack any formal manifestation of race, or that the international liberal order is quote unquote race neutral. Though this assumption is often reinforced by international fora, some of which were listed in that table, through principles designed to signal states' commitment to upholding norms against racism, recognition of equality de jure doesn't indicate equality in practice. I think this is where there's a difference here. So, scholars like Sultan Bousas, Rabi Shiliam, Siba Gravogli, Anthony Aji, there's just so many within the IR and the legal field that have made this exact point. I think in my dissertation on race and international law, I begin by acknowledging that there's this conventional wisdom that assumes that states are equal members of an international community. Much of this is rooted in conceptions of natural law, where international legal order is necessarily universal and based on such principles of equality. So this is very much the case in the formal sense. Yet race was implicated in the very development of international law. At one time, it was the notion of equality that governed relations between Europeans and reconciled exploitation of countries below the color line. The consolidation of race as a stable, self-evident kind of marker, it became the basis from which more elaborate ideas of difference, like civilization, were authorized. So the point here that I'm making is that the law itself actually required construction of racial hierarchies to justify its uneven application. And this isn't to say that international law or international institutions today in general are overtly racist. To be sure, racism is effectively written out of international law and institutions. However, it's this omission that I believe can serve this kind of dual function of preserving patterns of exclusion in practice. And this continues to be a trend, I believe, in contemporary world politics. And so, yeah, I think that one has to perhaps consider that, racial equality in word doesn't mean it's translating to outcome or to racial equality in practice.
Okay, thank you for that clarification and elaboration on how you differ from Busan's perspective. Yeah, in the article, you argue that racism in IR and international law can be found in terms of a projection of racial deficiency. Could you please elaborate on how this is manifested in today's world? Again, a world of sovereign and formally equal states. And if you want to, we can also perhaps share your really nice analytical framework. I love analytical frameworks and 2x2s and tables. So it would be really nice if, and I already have your analytical framework in the PowerPoint. So we could perhaps look at that as well when you hash out that question.
Oh, great. So this is from the annual review piece that I co-authored with DG Kim and David Blake. And so after taking stock of literature on race and IR and what we believe is the importance of approaching race and IR from a racial hierarchy standpoint, we first imagine this kind of double-sided coin, though possibly it's multi-sided, where perceived deficiency and perceived hostility are the two faces of racism in world politics. So in the first face, countries below the color line are perceived to be deficient in some essential attribute. So through the mid-20th century, this face of racism was manifested in the standard of civilization criteria for establishing sovereignty and acceptance into the family of nations. As the norm of juridical sovereignty took hold after the formation of the UN, confirmed sovereignty on any recognized member of the international community, regardless of its capacity to govern. The same projection of deficiency onto countries with majorities of people of color continued in practice and interpretation of international law. So this is that first phase. And much of my own work kind of captures or kind of grapples with this first phase. In the second phase, non-white majority countries are perceived by white majority countries to be inherently aggressive or threatening. Within a racialized global order, dominant actors perceive racially inferior foreign countries as potentially disabling to the status quo. And this is actually how Du Bois construed the problem of the color line in 1906. So the prospect of war and peace, it hinges upon how white majority countries cope with perceived challenges from the, quote, awakening of the brown and black races, end quote. So these two faces of the same coin in mind, we integrate this analytic framework intended to illustrate the intersections of racial hierarchy, of international law, and foreign policy. So in this figure here, we begin with norms, including the norm of racial hierarchy, which are so deeply woven into the fabric of social life that they appear natural, effectively conditioning both the design and enforcement of an international legal order. Once the embedded social norm is codified, international law further authorizes and promotes it, which is often the intended goal of norm entrepreneurs in international politics. So in other words, international law, both racialized in its content and enforcement, helps to consolidate what scholar Ruth Smith calls the authorized forms of difference along the color line. It's specifically the uneven application of law by race that we're concerned with here. So providing next that rules that order relations between states with different status, rights, and responsibilities, international law thus guides the practice of foreign policy making. So this in turn reproduces an unequal global order that is underwritten by an international legal system, as well as the racial hierarchy embedded within it. Racial hierarchy also implicates foreign policy in practice more directly as well. So the racial norm shapes foreign policies by conditioning how actors perceive their interests, interpret the position and interests of racial others, and act accordingly. So racial hierarchy affects foreign policy making through the process of legitimation, defined as the process of drawing and reestablishing boundaries, ruling some courses of action acceptable and others unacceptable. So by supplying the language of legitimation that shapes predominant foreign policy discourses, racial hierarchy renders certain foreign policies as acceptable and therefore possible. Similar to how international law facilitates the authorization of racial hierarchy, foreign policy and practice in turn further reinforces the norm of racial hierarchy, reifying the contrived racial categories and differences. So it was a mouthful, and those are my notes, but this is how my co-authors and I envision how the norm of racial hierarchy works, both affecting certain outcomes directly and in relation to other outcomes. So more indirectly.
Oh, okay. But this is not explicit. That
Right.
yeah. So the
Right.
projection of racial deficiency is not explicitly. I mean, it's not specifically explicitly articulated in terms of the language of racial deficiency, like in previous eras, like
Right.
racial biology and so on.
Right. No, that's absolutely right. And I think that's one of the challenges or the allures of just making the claim or the case that the international liberal order is race neutral or is firmly rooted in racial equality. One thing that I found that's been very helpful, and David Lake has been so helpful in this, is that we'll have conversations with each other and with DG, and we'll talk about, well, what does race and law look like in the U.S.? Criminal justice system there's so much evidence that the outcomes within criminal justice in the United States are very much ordered racially, and that there are strong patterns here. And we suggest that it's not much different in the international context. It's not that the laws themselves are explicitly racist, or that they're fully silent on the matter. It's that often it's how the laws and the principles are applied that may reveal some of these patterns that are racial in nature. It's a step further to actually theorize what's going on and how race matters and when it does, or the conditions under which race matters. But this analytic framework, we believe, helps us to begin understanding the ways that racial hierarchy may be directly or inadvertently shaping these outcomes. But it's often quiet. It's not explicit, as you mentioned.
Yeah, because I mean, it's very, in some sense, it's very different from, I mean, historically, we have the boundaries of humanity, we have the degrees of humanity, we have standards of civilization, racial biology, and so on. And I mean, explicit racism. But today, I mean, we don't really find that, at least not in public, that overt, explicit racial legitimation.
Right.
So it's more the patterned outcomes, so to speak,
Yes.
that reveals racial hierarchy.
Right.
But then one could perhaps argue about the cause about this. And perhaps that is where you have a challenge in convincing others that this is about race in terms of the cause.
Sure.
But I will get back to that, because that also relates to the question of race being epiphenomenal or not, which you also discuss. But I have another question that relates to what you just mentioned, because I just want to get at that point a bit deeper. In terms of this supposed deficiency. So you mentioned that this supposed deficiency can be manifested in terms of non-white majority countries being in need of assistance or corrective action. But why is this necessary about race? Why is this necessarily about race? Why could not interventions to improve, let's say, governance, property rights, taxation systems, or development assistance be based on so-called objective criteria, if you get what I'm trying to say here, or needs that are objective, irrespective of race? I mean, in terms of an analogy, if a country has poor infrastructure, it needs to build roads, dams, electricity grids, railways, ports, and so on to overcome this deficiency, right? And this deficiency is not necessarily about race.
Exactly. No, I really like this question. And it's something that I've had to confront, especially recently in my own work on R2P in particular. So
R2P, exactly, too. Yeah.
Right. I think initially my answer would be that both can be empirically true. In my own work, I acknowledge that race and capacity are conceptually distinct. But it's difficult to disentangle the racialization of a society or a community or a people from the racialization of its capacity. The racism towards a population will likely coincide with similar notions about its capacity. So these are pretty difficult to tease apart. But one piece that I would mention that comes to mind is Andy Baker's, he has a piece on racial paternalism in foreign aid a few years ago in the APSR. And Baker shows that through a series of survey experiments that racism doesn't just disappear when the welfare recipient or the person in quote unquote need is Black and overseas. So the outcome of foreign aid is just motivated differently here, even though there is still a need, in essence, by a more paternalistic kind of strings attached compassion or burden, if you will, whereby a failure to meet a responsibility results in intervention by someone else. So in his study, white Americans were more favorable toward aid when cued to think of the foreign poor as being of African descent versus of European descent. And I bring this up because this kind of example, it's not that there wasn't a valid need or that there were indicators of incapacity present. It's not that the relationship that Baker found was due to a greater perceived need of Black foreigners even, but he attributes this to an underlying racial view of non-white people overseas as lacking human agency, or being deficient, and therefore requiring assistance or a measure of corrective action. So again, this projection of deficiency, I believe, is racial, especially when the same or similar needs are observed in majority white countries or communities, both domestically and overseas. I do acknowledge that the range of indicators that of state capacity and some of the ones that you mentioned, they do capture important information about the quality of governance and a state's ability to perform core functions for survival. And if these, of course, have very real implications for people in those societies. However, the characteristics that these indicators capture, and this could be the extraction of revenue, protection from external threats, basic infrastructural needs, maintenance of internal order. These, they also reflect post-war institutions and policy decisions that were also shaped by both group level and individual bias. And that these things don't just go away. And in addition to these more kind of individual level or cognitive forms of bias, racial inequality can be structural, of course, as well. And that these decisions today may perhaps inherit some of these same institutions of empire. And you mentioned colonialism. And so it seems to me that both can be the case. It's just causally, it's difficult to disentangle the two.
Yeah.
E.G. Kim does really excellent work. And we talk about this in the review piece, where in order to get at some of those mechanisms causally, one approach would be survey experiments to tease out some of these dynamics, to assign a more kind of causal explanation to these outcomes as it pertains to race. So not impossible, but it seems to me that, and in my case with R2P, that these states may have indicators of incapacity based on the measures that exist, and there may be a very real need there and a goal to kind of prevent atrocity. But some of these decisions could also be influenced by race. Yeah, long-winded answer, but that's how I would.
Yeah, and you also, in some sense, answer the question that I want to ask in terms of race being epiphenomenal or not. So how can we know that race and racial motivations are not epiphenomenal? And that's a really hard task. It's not so easy to know, or at least we might know, we might have a conviction about it, and we might know, but it's not perhaps so easy to show, rather.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. No, I like how you said that. I think that we can be driven by certain intuitions, and there could be certain anecdotal evidence or lived experiences, which are all very informative. But it's another thing altogether to demonstrate these things.
And that is perhaps where you're limited as a positivist.
Right. And I think that's been some of the, I don't want people to be discouraged, but I think it's so challenging that it's definitely worth trying. But yes, it's not just race. The scholars that study gender in IR, which has addressed these challenges and overcome some of them. And so I don't see those that study race it being any different in that sense. But it's very difficult to disentangle these things. There are arguments, of course, that race is just a byproduct of something else, or it lacks causal influence, or that it's epiphenomenal to supposedly more fundamental axes of stratification. So some scholars will argue ethnicity. It's not race, but it's ethnicity, or it's class, or nation, or other things.
Or culture.
Or culture, absolutely, especially in intervention literature. And a colleague will.
Or epiphenomenal to a deeper strategic interest.
Right, absolutely, absolutely. And Will Nomikos, he studies intervention, and his, asking questions about, well, maybe race can tell us something additional that, culture or language or what's called kind of, cultural distance, these very important concepts in the aid and in the intervention literature. Maybe it can tell us something additional or different, even accounting for these other explanations. But certainly race, it's constitutive of social relations. So it in some ways, it can't really be separated from the context that it's a part of. And this is the case for gender, religion is another one. And so in the review piece, we do acknowledge that empirical work, positivists have to theorize the role and the effects of race before beginning any kind of empirical investigation. Because race is this way, and it's deeply embedded into many social relations. There are likely very few valid instrumental variables or exogenous shocks that permit a clear causal identification strategy. So we do acknowledge that, perhaps priming and framing experiments could be particularly useful for this endeavor. But no easy kind of satisfying answer. But that's, I think, part of
or archival work when things are declassified, or even WikiLeaks and emails between. I mean, Hillary Clinton's emails, perhaps, when it comes to the intervention in Libya.
Well, and consulting archival work is also so important, and that's something that I've done in my own work to get a better sense of, even though I'm looking at, perhaps a contemporary political trend in world politics, having some insight into how certain, policymakers, decision makers, those that, are involved in the formation of policies, knowing how they discussed it back then, I think can give me some purchase on how I may view how, for instance, SOPA's work today. And because some of those decisions, there's a path dependency perhaps, and some of those decisions were set, early post-war, but they're still having, they're still shaping how states interact today. Especially if there hasn't been a revision. So yeah, it's there's no one easy, I think, approach to this question of, is race really causal? But I think it's worth trying, and we can't really say until there's empirical work that attempts it.
Interesting. I was thinking about the responsibility to protect, and that you mentioned that interventions, R2P interventions, primarily concern African states. But then these responsibility to protect interventions, they are part of the United Nations system. So it's I mean, many countries are part of these decisions, and these decisions to make certain interventions in certain countries, not just Western countries, the United States and Western great powers and other Western nations or humanitarian superpowers like Sweden, but China and other countries, India, and also many African countries themselves, right? So how do you see what I'm trying to say here? Why is it about race as well when it involves all of these other actors?
Yes, so I'll do you one better. The kind of origin story of the principle of R2P was developed in the African context. So it was authored by African leaders, and
yeah, exactly.
And that's a common kind of response to the suggestion that maybe these decisions somewhere along the chain, race matters. And so in response to that, I would say that, even though these decisions and discussions happen in the UN, and this is kind of a international community setting, so to speak, that involves both white and non-white countries, especially on the Security Council. What I would say is that it doesn't mean that the decisions leading up to either R2P invocation or write out application, which is there are a few cases of that. it doesn't mean that certain decisions along the way aren't impacted by either a more structural racial hierarchy or perhaps a more kind of racial bias or perception of those that are deciding the terms from which this decision is made. And so again, this is ongoing work. So some of these questions we don't maybe yet have answers to in terms of kind of empirical evidence. But one thing I think is interesting is how this is invoked or applied. There's really great work, and it talks about, and you know, this is very similar, I think, to what goes on with international criminal law. And so there's some overlap here. And what I mean by that is the conditions for R2P are such where it's certain type of atrocities that tend to only occur in certain places in the world, or are graduated to international jurisdiction and scope, thus require intervention or merit it, versus atrocities or crimes that are relegated to the more domestic or transnational sphere. That isn't natural. Those are decisions, those are constructed differences. And typically the empirical pattern that we observe is that these kinds of things tend to occur in non-white countries, in Africa in particular. There are crimes, some legal scholars have brought up that things like environmental degradation, you know, instances of colonialism, empire, or even contemporary cases today. Environmental degradation is a great one. You know, those typically aren't targeted for any measure of intervention, but tend to kind of fall under, you know, domestic responsibility, or there's just really not much accountability, or there isn't an enforcement mechanism that's applied to those cases. I think what these legal scholars were trying to illustrate is that in terms of outcome, and so things that governments have control over and kind of fall under their auspice of responsibility to protect. In terms of outcome, there are decisions that carry a lot of weight for the kind of well-being of a community, and that these, and not that these require invocation, and I wouldn't compare the two types of, you know, cases or with that kind of atrocity, but I think what they're trying to say is that there may be virtually no discussion within these UN bodies about these very real policy decisions with very real consequences. And so, and I do think that that is worth thinking a little bit about, and that's, I think you've highlighted one of the challenges to studying this kind of topic. No one is making a normative claim here, or that, well, you know, these atrocities, you know, shouldn't be considered, or so on and so forth. I think what some scholars are suggesting is that looking at the pattern and understanding that though intervention may be agreed upon, or there's a consensus, or maybe even the country or the communities that are you know, victimized by certain atrocities, even though they may themselves be requesting international intervention, it doesn't mean that certain decisions along the way aren't motivated racially. As I mentioned, I think earlier, there have been scholars that look at this very question and examine, well, whose expertise, who is invited as an expert, who is hired as an investigator in these cases where you're working with predominantly people of color, and it tends to not be people of color. It tends to be countries European descent. And so it's kind of looking at those things, and just to gain better insight on how these decisions come about, and, you know, what race means for, you know, the implications of these decisions.
Yeah, you also wrote in the article that racialized beliefs can have far-reaching effects on other types of foreign security and military policies, such as regional institution building and territorial expansion. When I read that, I mean, of course, I came to think about the EU and potential membership of Turkey, for instance, and other members, and EU and its relationship with Africa. But I also came to think about why Papua New Guinea is not an ASEAN member. I don't know if you have thought about that, but that just came to my mind. And they have had an observer status for decades, but never been formally a member. And it's not formally a member. And if you just Google it fast, they say that ASEAN is or that Papua New Guinea is a Pacific state or a Pacific nation, and you'll see some other explanations, perhaps since where they say that the institutions are not developed, or cultural issues, but maybe it's really about race, really, when you think about it, given that they have had observer status for such a long time, and the internal conditions of Papua New Guinea, they might be problematic and so on, but I mean nothing compared to countries that are ASEAN members like Cambodia or Laos and Burma or Myanmar that have their own problems domestically. So all of those reasons seem strange when you look at it.
And you know, in listening to you, I think that what comes to mind is something that Zoltan Busa says, and I couldn't agree more, is that you know, race doesn't explain everything, and scholars that study it don't want it to explain everything, because it can't. There's variation, and it may explain some of it, and it may end up being important for understanding certain outcomes. And so when we think about, well, maybe there are strategic motivations, the country is pursuing its interests, or maybe there are kind of X, Y, and Z explanations, absolutely. But controlling for all of those things, you know, one can endeavor to, if there's, you know, a theoretical reason to do so, one can endeavor to find out if race is contributing to how states interact with each other along a variety of outcomes. And so if there's a takeaway, I would hope that scholars and just students that are interested in this topic, that when they come across an argument that suggests, oh, well, it's race, or maybe it's, you know, racial paternalism, or it's structural in nature, or another form of difference, I don't think one is making the claim that it's only race. It's just that race may be contributing to how states perceive each other, perceive each other's interests, and pursue them. And so, yeah, I think I've really come to appreciate that approach. And I think it's a more kind of sober, restrained approach to examining really anything when it comes to interstate interaction.
Okay, yeah. Thank you very much for that elaboration and clarification again. And thank you very much for going through some of the questions I had in relation to the article, which is a really nice article. And it's giving a very good overview into the field, I think. And I really like the analytical framework. It's awesome. I will definitely use it for my own teaching. So thank you for that.
Of course.
It has been a pleasure to talk to you. Sorry for taking so much time.
No, likewise, it's been so nice. And the questions you ask are really helpful for me, because I know that some, you know, the motivation behind some of these series that you facilitate are for PhD students or prospective students. And so, you know, I'm still a current PhD student. And so these questions and having to grapple with them, it only helps me think through, my own views of these questions and challenges to the research. So no, it's been a real pleasure for me.
Okay, great. And make sure that you send me the articles when they are published, the other ones that you're working on.
Yeah. Thank you. You're very kind. My fingers are crossed. Yeah.
All right. All the very best. Take care.
Thank you, John.
Bye-bye.